When people talk about how pedophiles are treated in prison, they often overlook the main types of offenders in prison, which immediately distorts the entire conversation. At first glance, it seems like the inmates have a sense of justice, but that assumption breaks down once you actually examine the types of offenders who would target pedophiles. The real issue is not the crimes of pedophiles, but rather the social pushback, especially when you consider the time many offenders are serving. This is why those who believe in inmate justice should rethink how they understand the inmate system, because the implications extend far beyond the offense of the pedophiles. Before diving deeper, it's important to separate the claims of many inmates from the lived experiences of pedophiles, and recognize how the stories shape the entire discussion moving forward into the analysis ahead. The claim that pedophiles are targets in prison assumes that most inmates are serving the harshest sentences for the harshest crimes, but that assumption collapses because most inmates are property criminals or drug offenders serving years instead of decades or life. In practice, this means most inmates are not going to risk adding decades to a sentence they might not even have to serve in full. For example, the average sentence for an inmate is around 11 years, where they'll be up for parole in around 5. When examined further, the argument relies on the assumption that unaliving a pedophile will not affect the sentencing of the mandatory minimum being served, which is not actually demonstrated. This creates a myth that the death of a pedophile is inevitable. If applied consistently, it would imply a justice system within the prison population. A clearer interpretation is that pedophiles are no more a target than anyone else, which avoids the issue. Therefore, the original argument does not hold under its own standards. In short, even though there's a tier system, which places pedophiles at, maybe, the lowest rung, there is no actual justice system among inmates. To conclude, the claim that a pedophile will face consequences for their crimes at the hands of other inmates does not hold under scrutiny. When we look at how many offenders are housed, it becomes clear that violent offenders, sexual offenders, and property or drug offenders don't interact with each other enough to give up the peace too much that the prison system tries to maintain. Additionally, the sentences served by most pedophiles further demonstrates that the inmate justice system is, at the very least, exaggerated. Even if one argues that pedophiles get treated the worst in prison, the evidence from the housing system in prison shows that pedophiles face the worst treatment from other schmex offenders due to streetwise culture that forms in some of the units. Overall, the most reasonable interpretation is that pedophiles are not more harshly targeted than other inmates, because the targeting of an inmate who happens to be a pedophile isn't necessarily because they're a pedophile. This matters because there is no actual virtue in targeting someone for the nature of their crime. In short, many pedophiles do very well in the prison system, and any fair assessment of prison culture must account for the majority of pedophiles who complete their sentences without issue. Therefore, the strongest position remains that what we hear is hype, not because it's convenient, but because it aligns with the reality and the reasoning. That is the conclusion drawn from the full analysis above. Any contrary view requires stronger evidence.